On a cold night in the American heartland, in a town small enough that maps barely bothered to name it, the sky tore open. There was no warning, no storm, no sound of thunder. One moment the stars hung quiet over empty farmland. The next, a wound of orange fire split the darkness, and through it came a sound no living throat could make, the roar of an engine running on something older than gasoline. A motorcycle burst from the rift and hit the earth in a spray of burning gravel. It did not slow. It did not wobble. It rolled onto the county road as if it had always belonged there, tires trailing ribbons of flame that died slowly on the asphalt behind it. Above, the rift folded in on itself and vanished, leaving only the stars, indifferent as ever. The rider sat motionless for a long moment, leather creaking, gloved hands resting on the handlebars. Then the fire came. It crawled up his arms, across his shoulders, and swallowed his head whole, and where a face should have been there was only a skull wrapped in flame, eyes burning like two coals pulled from the floor of hell. Ghost Rider had crossed worlds before. The spirit of vengeance did not travel for pleasure, and it did not travel by accident. Something had called it here. Something in this universe radiated corruption so dense, so concentrated, that it had punched through the membrane between realities like a fist through wet paper. The rider had followed the stench the way a shark follows blood. He rode into the town as dawn threatened the horizon, and what he found troubled even him. He had hunted evil in 1,000 forms across 1,000 roads, demons wearing human skin, men wearing the skins of saints. He knew every disguise wickedness owned. But this world was different, and he felt it in the marrow of his burning bones. Here, evil did not lurk in alleys. It did not hide in shadows or whisper from the dark. Here, evil wore capes. It smiled for cameras. It signed contracts in boardrooms and held press conferences and sold lunchboxes to children. It had legal departments. The wrongness of this world was not hidden at all. It was advertised. He stopped at the edge of a cordoned street where emergency lights painted the buildings in strokes of red and blue. A superhero incident, the officers were calling it. Supe had pursued a suspect through a residential block, and the pursuit had ended with a gas main ruptured and 4 civilians dead in the collapse of a family home. The suspect had escaped. The Supe had already left, flown off to a morning talk show appearance in another time zone. Ghost Rider watched from the dark beyond the barricades, and his fire burned low and cold. He could smell the lies settling over the scene like ash. Men in plainclothes were already moving among the police. Quiet men with credentials and calm voices, guiding the story, collecting phones, suggesting alternative explanations. Vought's cleanup division. They had done this 100 times. They were very good at it. On a billboard above the wreckage, a glowing advertisement cycled to life. A row of beautiful heroes stood against an American sky, and a warm voice promised the town, the country, the world, that Vought's heroes were watching over them, that they were safe, that someone would always answer. The dead beneath the rubble could not hear it. The men sweeping the street of evidence would not answer for it. The flaming skull lifted toward the screen, and the fire around it twisted, slow and thoughtful, the way a fire leans toward dry wood. For the first time in all its endless hunt, the spirit of vengeance understood something new about the nature of evil. In this world, the greatest monster might not be any single creature. It might not have claws or horns or a name whispered in frightened prayers. It might be a system, a machine built from money and lies and smiling faces, grinding ordinary people into nothing and calling the grinding entertainment. An evil so large that no one's soul carried it, and so every soul involved believed themselves innocent. Ghost Rider turned his motorcycle toward the distant glow of the great city on the horizon, where a tower rose above all the others, crowned with a name he had already seen a dozen times tonight. The engine roared. The flames followed, and far away in that tower a machine of a different kind was already waking up. A traffic camera on a county road had captured 9 seconds of impossible footage, a burning rider crossing a dark highway at impossible speed. By morning, that footage would travel up the chain of command at Vought International, past analysts and managers, onto the desk of people who saw the entire world as a portfolio of assets and threats. They would not see a judgment riding toward them. They would see an unidentified superhuman, a product without an owner, a threat without a price tag, and they would make the first mistake. They would decide to capture him. The footage reached the 82nd floor of Vought Tower before sunrise, and by 9 o'clock it had been dissected frame by a room full of analysts who had built careers on knowing everything about everyone with powers. They enhanced the images. They ran facial recognition, which returned nothing because there was no face. They ran the motorcycle through every vehicle registry on the continent. Nothing. They compared the energy readings from the traffic camera's sensors against every known Supe signature in the database, and the database, for the first time in its existence, had no answer to give. Ashley Barrett stood at the head of the conference table with her jaw clenched and her mind already 10 moves ahead, the way it always was. She asked the questions that mattered to Vought. What is he? What can he do? What are his weaknesses? And then, quieter, more dangerous, the question that revealed the true soul of the company she served. What is he worth? Because that was the thing about Vought. Even faced with a burning skull on a motorcycle that defied every known law of physics, the company's imagination went not to fear but to branding. By lunch, someone in marketing had already coined a name for him. Half joke and half genuine pitch. The Hellfire Hero. They could see the merchandise, the movie deal, the limited series. If this thing could be caught, studied, owned, it could be monetized. Everything could be monetized. That was the first commandment of Vought International, and no one on the 82nd floor had ever questioned it. Homelander heard about the rider that afternoon, and he laughed. It was a genuine laugh, the kind he rarely bothered with. Another enhanced nobody wandering into his sky, his country, his spotlight. He had swatted down 100 ambitious Supes. He told the executives to keep him informed, and then he forgot about it entirely, the way a lion forgets a rumor of another cat somewhere beyond the river. The lion should have paid attention, because while Vought studied him, Ghost Rider was studying Vought. He moved through the country like a rumor, appearing at the edges of incidents the company thought it had buried. A Supe who had beaten a man to death outside a bar, never charged. A test site in the desert where something had gone wrong and an entire town's water had quietly been condemned. A hospital where powered infants were cataloged like livestock. Everywhere he went, he found the same fingerprints, the same logo, the same smiling lie laid gently over the suffering. He learned about Compound 5, the serum that built this world's gods. It was not supernatural. He had expected sorcery and found chemistry, and that surprised him. But chemistry could not explain the stain. The spirit of vengeance perceived what instruments could not, and what it perceived was a spiritual wound spreading outward from every vial, every injection, every arrogant soul granted power without wisdom. The serum did not create evil. It simply removed the consequences of it. And a world without consequences, the rider knew better than anyone, is a world that breeds monsters. So he turned toward the source. Vought's research facilities dotted the country like unmarked graves, and he began visiting them, one by one, silent as smoke. It was outside the third facility, a squat concrete complex in the hills of Virginia, that Vought finally sprang its trap. 40 operatives, hand-picked, armed with sonic cannons and high-voltage containment rigs designed for the most violent Supes alive. They hit him the moment he crossed the perimeter. A wall of sound and electricity meant to drop a charging Supe mid-stride. Ghost Rider walked through it. The gunfire came next, hundreds of rounds, and the rounds flattened and fell or simply vanished into the fire. The chains came off his shoulders like living things, molten and shrieking, and the night turned orange. A transport vehicle flipped end over end and bloomed into flame. A sonic cannon tore itself apart. Men who had spent careers believing they were the hunters discovered, all at once, that they were not. They fled, every one of them. And this is the detail the report emphasized later, the detail that should have frightened Vought more than any other. He did not chase them. He did not kill a single man. He simply stood in the wreckage of their finest weapons, burning and motionless, and turned his skull toward the northeast, toward the tower, toward the heart of it. He knew where the corruption began. He had always known. Every road he had ridden across this strange country had bent toward that tower like rivers bending toward the sea. Back on the 82nd floor, the atmosphere had changed. The branding talk was gone. The analysts who had smirked about the Hellfire Hero now spoke in low voices about casualty probabilities and containment failures. Ashley Barrett watched the satellite footage of the Virginia facility for the 4th time, and her hands, which never shook. And Homelander watched too. He stood before the screen with his arms folded and his head tilted, studying the way the fire moved, the way the chains struck, the way the soldiers ran. Something shifted behind his eyes, not fear. Homelander did not believe fear was something that happened to him. It was interest. Bright, hungry, dangerous interest. For years, nothing on this earth had presented him with a genuine unknown. No opponent had ever required his full strength. No fight had ever been anything but theater. He smiled at the burning skull on the screen. He finally had someone interesting to fight, and Homelander had already decided how it would happen, not quietly. Not in some distant facility with no witnesses. If he was going to put this thing down, the world was going to watch him do it. That was the second mistake. They chose the city deliberately. Vought's media machine moved with practiced precision, seeding rumors of a rogue Superman threat, positioning cameras, alerting friendly networks that something historic might happen in the downtown corridor at midday. By the time Homelander descended from the clouds, thousands of people filled the streets below. Phones raised, the great ritual of the modern world. Terror and entertainment blended into a single spectacle. He came down like scripture. Red, white, and blue against the gray sky, Kate moving in a wind that existed only for him, landing in the center of the intersection with just enough force to crack the pavement. Because cracked pavement photographed well. The crowd roared. He turned slowly, letting them see his profile from every angle, and he waited. The engine sound arrived before the rider did. It rolled up the avenue like approaching thunder, and the crowd's roar faltered as heads turned. Out of the canyon of buildings came the motorcycle, trailing fire, and it stopped 50 paces from the most powerful man on Earth. The rider dismounted unhurried, chains swaying, skull burning beneath the noon sun. Homelander had expected fear. He fed on it the way other men feed on praise. But the thing before him radiated nothing he recognized. No awe, no terror, no calculation. Just fire, and beneath the fire, something old and patient, watching him the way a judge watches a liar construct an alibi. So Homelander filled the silence the way he always did. With himself, he mocked the skull. He mocked the jacket, the bike, the theatrics. Loud enough for the cameras, he demanded to know who this was, what lab had cooked him up, what he thought he was doing in Homelander's city. The crowd laughed on cue. It was a good performance. Ghost Rider let him finish. Then the skull tilted, and a voice came out of the fire that sounded like stones grinding at the bottom of a grave, and it asked one question: "How many have you killed?" The laughter died. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate. Homelander's smile held for half a second too long before he rebuilt it, and he answered with a joke, light and easy. The murderer shrugged, dressed as charm. But something in the air had changed, and every person in that crowd felt it without understanding why. The question was not an accusation. It was a count. Something was counting. Ghost Rider looked at him then, truly looked, and the spirit of vengeance saw everything. It saw the laboratory where a frightened boy had been raised without a mother, without a touch that was not an experiment. It saw the scientists who taught him that love was leverage and pain was data. It saw the first man the boy ever killed, and the way no one punished him, and the lesson that silence taught. It saw the decades after, the staged rescues, the bodies dropped from heights, the plane full of screaming people abandoned to the water because saving them was inconvenient, the threats whispered into the ears of colleagues, the terror administered like medicine to anyone who forgot that he was a god. All of it, every hidden thing. The rider saw it the way a fire sees a forest. Homelander felt the gaze pass through him, and something ancient in his chest, something he had buried under 40 years of vanity and power, curled inward like a hand closing. No one looked at him like that. No one was allowed to look at him like that. He attacked. The heat vision came first, twin spears of searing red light that had cut through steel, through bone, through every obstacle he had ever aimed them at. They struck Ghost Rider full in the chest and blew a crater out of the street behind him, shattered windows for 2 blocks, sent the screaming crowd surging backward. When the dust cleared, the rider was still standing, fire undimmed, head tilted with something that looked almost like disappointment. Then the chains moved. They came faster than eyes could follow, white-hot and screaming, and one of them caught Homelander across the chest and hurled him through the granite face of a bank. The sound rolled across the city like a bomb. The crowd froze in collective disbelief because in all the years of staged battles and managed narratives, no one had ever seen Homelander knocked backward. No one, ever. He came out of the rubble with blood on his lip and madness in his eyes, and the fight that followed tore the heart out of 3 city blocks. He was faster and he was stronger, and none of it mattered the way it was supposed to matter. The writer absorbed punishment that should have unmade him and returned fire that burned in ways physics could not explain. Homelander tore a bus in half and swung it. The writer rode up the side of a building and came down on him like a meteor. And somewhere in the middle of it, between one impact and the next, the spirit of vengeance discovered the thing it had not expected. Beneath the cruelty, beneath the towering, bottomless malignancy of this soul, there was a wound, old and deep and still bleeding. The rage was real, but it was not the root. At the bottom of this monster was a child who had never once been loved, twisting in a pain he had spent a lifetime converting into the suffering of others. It did not excuse him. The spirit of vengeance did not deal in excuses. A wound explains a monster. It never absolves one. But it made him more dangerous, not less, because a man fighting to outrun his own pain will burn the world down before he lets anyone see him limp. The battle might have ended there in fire and concrete if Vought had not intervened. From 4 directions at once, aircraft swept in carrying the company's newest containment technology, an experimental dampening field built from the failed fragments of a dozen secret programs. The field hit Ghost Rider like a falling sky, and for the first time since arriving in this world, he staggered. The fire guttered, the chains fell slack. It lasted 9 seconds. 9 seconds was almost enough. The rider tore free of the field in an explosion of hellfire that sent the aircraft spinning away, trailing smoke, and when the smoke cleared, he was gone. No wreckage, no trail. Vanished into a city of 8 million people like smoke into wind. Homelander stood alone in the ruined intersection, bleeding in front of 10,000 cameras, while the crowd he had spent his life dazzling stared at him in silence. Not adoring silence. The other kind. The kind with a question in it. By midnight, the footage was everywhere. And on the 82nd floor of Vought Tower, behind soundproof glass, the most powerful people in the world confronted a conclusion none of them had the language for. They could not control him. They could not hurt him. They could not buy him, brand him, or bury him. So they did what frightened institutions always do. They reached for everything they had left, including the assets they normally kept leashed. The 7 would hunt the devil. The order went out under a priority classification the 7 had only seen twice before. Full assembly, combat readiness, target unknown. In the conference room at the top of the tower, beneath the enormous screen that usually displayed their own faces, Vought's flagship team gathered and listened to a briefing that raised more questions than it answered. Starlight was the first to object, and she did not bother lowering her voice. She had read the incident reports. She had seen what the executives refused to say out loud, that in every encounter, the rider had walked away from fleeing soldiers, had ignored panicking civilians, had killed no one who was not actively trying to kill him. They were not deploying against a rampaging monster. They were deploying against something they did not understand, on the word of people who had lied to her about everything else she had ever believed. She said so, plainly, and the room went cold. A train said nothing at all, which was unlike him. And the reason was simple. He had watched the downtown footage 17 times. He had measured the speed of those chains. He was the fastest man alive, and some deep animal part of him had already run the calculation of that fight 100 times, and every version of it ended the same way. He was frightened, and the fear sat in him like a stone. The Deep asked, with complete sincerity, whether the target could be reasoned with, or possibly impressed. Queen Maeve closed her eyes. Black Noir, silent as ever, studied the still frames of the burning skull with an intensity no one could read, and did not volunteer a word. It was Maeve who finally named what the rest of them were circling. She had been at Vought longer than any of them except Homelander. She had watched the company absorb every threat it had ever faced, through money, through blackmail, through Homelander himself. And now she watched Ashley Barrett's people brief the most powerful team on Earth like a gambler pushing in his last chips. And she understood. Vought was afraid, not concerned, not cautious. Afraid. In Maeve's long experience, that had never happened before. They found Ghost Rider where he wanted to be found, at an abandoned Vought research facility in the industrial dead zone outside the city. a place the company had shuttered years ago and never quite scrubbed from its records. He had come for the archives. The 7 came through the roof. The battle that followed would have been legend in any other world. A train hit first, a blur moving faster than sound, and learned the terrible lesson his fear had already taught him. He could not outrun the fire. The flames did not chase him. They simply waited where he was going to be, blooming out of the concrete ahead of every turn, herding him like a sheepdog herds a sheep, until he slid to a gasping stop in a corridor lit orange on every side and understood, with perfect clarity, that he had never been the fastest thing in this room. The deep summoned the churn of a flooded sublevel and drove it against the rider like a battering ram. The water hit the fire and became steam, and the steam became nothing, and the deep stood dripping in the doorway, confronting the possibility that his entire existence had been priced incorrectly. Black Noir lasted the longest. He moved without sound and without fear, blades finding gaps, body absorbing impacts that would have folded anyone else. And for almost a full minute he gave the spirit of vengeance something resembling a fight. But there was no cruelty in him for the fire to seize, only a strange, sad obedience, and in the end the rider simply put him down, hard and almost gently, like a man quieting a dog that does not know why it was ordered to bite. Through all of it, Ghost Rider killed no one. He could have. Every one of them felt it, the restraint like a blade deliberately turned sideways. He was not here for them. He was asking the building a question, and they were merely in the way of the answer. Starlight understood it first, because she was the only one who wanted to. While the others regrouped, she watched the rider tear through sealed doors and ignore unconscious enemies. And she saw the pattern. He was not attacking. He was searching. And every instinct she had left told her that whatever he was looking for, Vought did not want it found. And that meant she needed to know what it was. So she made a choice that could have ended her life, and she made it quietly. She lit a maintenance panel with a soft glow of her hands when he passed, a small, deliberate beacon, and when the burning skull turned toward her, she did not raise her fists. She typed her own access credentials into the archive terminal, the classified ones Vought did not know she had copied, and she stepped aside. The files opened like a mass grave. Compound V had been tested on children, not occasionally, systematically for decades, in facilities that did not officially exist, on infants acquired through channels the files described only in euphemism. Most died. Some became assets. A few became something the records could not categorize. And beneath all of it, buried under encryption layers stacked like coffin lids, sat a single project hidden even from Homelander himself. A project that referenced energy signatures matching the ones the analysts had recorded in the downtown crater. A project that mentioned dimensional readings and containment failures, and words that had no business appearing in a pharmaceutical company's archive. Words like summoning and judgment and spirit. The project's name filled the screen in cold block letters. Project Vengeance. Starlight read it over the rider's shoulder and felt the temperature of the room drop, though the fire had not dimmed. She did not understand what she was looking at. Ghost Rider did. And for the first time since crossing into this world, the spirit of vengeance felt something it had not felt in a very long time. Not anger, something colder. The recognition that the evil here was not merely a system of greed and lies. Vought had reached further than greed. They had reached into the dark between worlds, and they had grabbed hold of something, and they had caged it, and they truly believed the cage would hold. He turned from the terminal. The fire climbed higher. Vought had not simply discovered hellfire. They had tried to build their own. The truth, when Ghost Rider finally assembled it from the archive's scattered fragments, went back further than anyone at Vought would have admitted. It had begun 11 years earlier, in the aftermath of a Supe incident in New Mexico, when Vought recovery teams combing the desert found something that should not have been there. Beneath the crash site, sealed in a lava tube that predated the highway above it by 10,000 years, they found artifacts, carved stone, cooled metal that no metallurgist could identify, and residue clinging to the rock itself, an energy that lit up instruments in ways the company's scientists had never seen and could not stop thinking about. The first report called it anomalous. The second report called it an opportunity. There was no third report, because by then the project had gone dark, moved off every official ledger into the kind of black budget that even Vought's board pretended not to know about. The scientists did what scientists at Vought always did. They combined things. They introduced the anomalous energy to compound V, and the reaction was immediate and terrifying. The serum responded to the energy like a plant turning toward the sun. Test subjects exposed to both did not simply gain power. They began to change in ways the data could not capture. They spoke about judgment. They described hearing accusations in empty rooms. 2 of them burned to death in sealed chambers without any detectable heat source, and the autopsies found their bones charred from the inside. A sane institution would have stopped. Vought accelerated, because buried in the horror was a possibility so intoxicating that no executive who heard it could let it go. The artifacts suggested that judgment, actual supernatural judgment, the kind written about in dead religions and whispered about in the files of intelligence agencies, was not myth. It was a force, a real, measurable, harvestable force. And if it was real, then the company that learned to wield it would not merely dominate the superhero market. It would own the concept of punishment itself. Courts, armies, gods, all obsolete. Vought would become the final authority on guilt. They called the program Project Vengeance, and they built it a home 300 feet beneath their most secure facility. A vault lined with the recovered artifacts, where they attempted to grow a spirit of judgment the way they grew Supes. On schedule, to specification, owned. It did not work. It almost worked, which was infinitely worse. What they created in that vault was not a spirit of vengeance. It was an imitation, assembled from fragments, fed on compound V and occult residue, and the raw material the company had in endless supply, human suffering. Pain had a signature, the scientists discovered. Rage had a frequency. And the thing in the vault absorbed both the way a fire absorbs air. It grew on every experiment Vought had ever buried, every life the company had ever spent, every scream that had ever echoed in one of its soundproof rooms. It had no soul of its own. It was a hollow shaped exactly like one, filled with everything Vought had ever done and refused to feel. The scientists named the failure, sealed the vault, and filed reports that read like controlled panic. Then the executives did the most Vought thing imaginable. They kept it, not because they could use it, because they could not bring themselves to destroy an asset. Someday, they believed, they would find the lever that controlled it. There was always a lever. There was no lever. And 11 years later, the thing in the vault had stopped waiting to be fed. It had begun to reach. Ghost Rider now understood the shape of his own arrival, and the understanding settled over him like a sentence. The disturbance that had torn the membrane between worlds had not been random. It had not summoned him the way a beacon summons a rescue. The thing in the vault, starving and straining against its cage, had punched through the fabric of reality, trying to reach the one force in all existence that resembled what it was pretending to be. It had reached for true judgment, the way a drowning thing reaches for a swimmer, and the true thing had answered. He had. There was a terrible symmetry in it that the spirit of vengeance did not miss. This false spirit was not an abomination from outside the world. It was a mirror. Vought had looked into the dark and demanded to see power, and the dark had shown the company a perfect reflection of itself, a hunger wearing the costume of justice, a weapon that believed its own mythology. The company had spent decades manufacturing heroes that were really products. Now it had manufactured judgment that was really appetite. It was the same crime, committed one level deeper, against reality itself. He rode for the facility that same night, and Starlight's stolen credentials got him past the outer perimeter before the alarms understood what was happening. He descended into the earth, past sublevels of archives and laboratories, and the fire around his skull burned lower and colder with every floor, because he could feel it now, directly, the way one feels the pressure of deep water. 300 feet down, something enormous was breathing in its sleep, and its dreams were made of screaming. He stood before the vault door, a slab of black alloy etched with warning sigils the company's consultants had copied from the artifacts without understanding them, and he raised his chains to tear the world open and end this thing in its cage. That was when the ceiling came down. Homelander arrived through 3 floors of concrete and steel like a falling judgment of his own, and he landed between Ghost Rider and the vault with dust rolling off his shoulders and his eyes burning red. But the red was not aimed at the rider. Not yet. Homelander had spent 2 days pulling threads, following the fear in his own executives' voices. And he had found what the rider had found. Vought, his company, his creators, his family in every poisoned sense of the word, had been hiding something from him for 11 years, something powerful enough to make men who controlled the world speak in whispers. No one hid things from Homelander. That was the law of his existence, the single term on which his loyalty rested, and it had been broken. So there they stood, the two most dangerous beings in this world, 50 feet apart in the deep earth, with a starving false god breathing behind a black door. Enemies. Both of them certain of it, and yet, for the first time, aimed at the same target. Ghost Rider looked at him and saw the whole wretched architecture of the man, the wound and the cruelty built on top of it, the god costume over the frightened child. Homelander looked at the rider and saw the thing that had made him bleed in front of 10,000 cameras, the question made of fire. "How many have you killed?" Neither trusted the other. Neither moved first. And 300 feet above them, in a control room already filling with panicked executives, someone made the decision that would define everything that came after. Containment was failing on its own. The readings were spiking beyond every projection. The vault was going to open. The only question left was whether anything in this world would still be standing after it did. The containment system did not explode. It exhaled. 300 feet beneath Vought's most secure facility, the black alloy doors swung outward on seals that had been straining for 11 years. And what came through it was not a creature in any shape the human eye could hold. It was smoke that moved like muscle. It was a wound in the air that howled with 1,000 voices. And every voice was real. Every voice had once belonged to someone Vought had used up and discarded. It did not climb toward the surface. It flowed upward through the building like water running uphill, and everywhere it touched, it fed. The researchers in the lower levels were the first to die, and the manner of it set the pattern for everything that followed. The thing did not burn them or tear them. It showed them. Every file they had falsified, every subject they had numbered instead of named, every moment they had chosen the grant over the conscience, they relived it all at once from the other side, inside the pain they had authored, and their hearts simply stopped under the weight of it. The entity grew a little larger with each one. By the time it reached the city, it had learned to love the feeding. Vought Tower, the shining cathedral of the superhero age, became the center of a nightmare that no publicist could spin. The entity poured into it not because it was the tallest building, but because it was the richest ground. Suffering saturated that tower like radiation. Decades of blackmail archives, of staged rescues, of human beings treated as inventory. Every cruel email and buried complaint and erased witness had left a residue in the walls. And the entity drank it all. Employees fled screaming into the streets. Security systems turned on their masters. Elevators fell. The great screens that had shown Homelander's face to the world now showed nothing but smoke and fire. And into this, out of the sky, came the most powerful man on Earth, and he hit the entity with everything he had. It was the first time in his life that everything was not enough. His heat vision, which had cut through every material known to man, passed into the smoke and simply disappeared, swallowed. He struck it with fists that had leveled buildings, and the entity parted around him like black water and closed behind him unharmed. He tore a support column free and drove it through the heart of the thing, and the column came out the other side rotted to nothing, and the heart, if it had one, did not care. The entity turned its attention to him then, and Homelander felt something he had spent his entire existence believing was reserved for other people. It looked inside him. Not at his strength, not at the icon, not at the product. Inside. And it found the richest meal in the building, decades of cruelty layered over a bottomless, shrieking fear. And it began, very slowly, to pull. Homelander, for the first time since the laboratory, was afraid. The engine sound came up through the burning lobby like the arrival of a second apocalypse, and Ghost Rider burst into the great atrium of Vought Tower in a shower of glass and embers. He took in the scene in an instant, the feeding entity, the failing god, and he did not do what the old laws of vengeance demanded. He did not let the monster have him. Instead, he rode between them, and his chains cut the entity's grip loose from Homelander's soul. And he spoke to the most hated man in the world with something that was almost pity. "You wanted to be a god," the rider said. "Now face something that doesn't worship you." What followed became the largest battle this world had ever witnessed, though almost no one survived close enough to describe it. They fought together, the spirit of vengeance and the false god of America, back to back in the burning ruin of the temple built to lies. Homelander tore at the entity's physical mass, ripping chunks of solidified smoke apart faster than it could reform, buying seconds with fury. Ghost Rider struck at what Homelander could not touch, the spiritual architecture of the thing, burning through the stolen suffering that held it together, severing whole choruses of trapped voices and setting them free as the entity screamed. Starlight came in through the collapsed east face with her hands blazing, not at the monster but at the building, carving escape routes through debris, dragging the living out of the path of the dying. The Deep held a flooded stairwell back with everything he had so a crowd of janitors and junior analysts could climb past it. Even a train ran, not away, through the fire, carrying people out two at a time until his heart screamed louder than the building. And Maeve saw the support span above the west lobby begin to fail with 200 trapped employees beneath it. And she did not hesitate, because this was the moment her whole compromised, embittered, half-ruined life had been waiting for without her knowing it. She got under the falling steel and she held it. She held it while they ran, held it as her knees buckled, held it until the last of them was clear. And when it finally came down, it took her with it. And she went out of this world the way she had always wanted to, and never believed she would. As a hero, the real kind. The kind Vought had never once been able to manufacture. Ghost Rider felt her pass, even in the heart of the battle, and the fire bowed its head for exactly 1 second. But the entity was still growing. That was the horror of it. Every act of fear in the city below fed it. Every siren, every scream, every cruel thing anyone had ever done in this whole poisoned town was rising off the streets like heat, and the thing in the tower drank it through the open sky. It was no longer in the building. It was becoming the building and then something larger than the building, a storm with a heartbeat, and Ghost Rider understood with cold clarity that the mathematics of this fight did not resolve. Brute force, his or Homelander's or anyone's, could not win it. You cannot punch hunger. You cannot beat appetite to death. The thing had been made from the consequences of human choices. Every crime Vought had committed had been a brick in its body, which meant it could only be unmade at the source. And even as the rider reached that conclusion, 300 feet below them, in the control room where the surviving executives had gathered like rats on a sinking ship, trembling hands reached for the company's last idea. The master system, the network of occult amplifiers wired through the tower's foundation, built in secret to somehow harness the entity. Vaught's final mistake was about to happen. The executives did it for the oldest reason in the company's history, not malice, not even desperation exactly. They did it because controlling things was the only skill any of them had ever possessed. And when people whose whole identity is control face something uncontrollable, they reach for the lever even as the machine comes apart around them. The lead systems director looked at the readings, looked at the faces around the table, and said the words that had ended 1,000 cautionary tales. We can modulate it. We can steer it. Turn it on. They turned it on. The amplification network had been designed to bind the entity to a controller's will, to make judgment a product with a remote in some executive's hand. What it actually did, in the 11 seconds before anyone understood their error, was give a starving thing a much larger mouth. The occult amplifiers buried in the tower's foundation did not contain the entity's reach. They extended it. The signal rolled outward from Vought Tower in a silent burning ring, across the avenues, across the river, across the whole glittering island, and the city of 8 million souls was wrapped, all at once, in fire that did not burn the body. It burned the memory. Everywhere the ring passed, people saw themselves. That is the only honest way to describe what happened that night. A man running a protection racket in the Bronx stopped mid-stride in the street and met the eyes of every shopkeeper he had ever terrorized. Felt every dollar leave his hand a second time. A judge who had sold verdicts watched a decade of the wrongly convicted file pass her in her own living room. Corrupt executives in their penthouses stood face to face with the clinical trial subjects whose deaths had been rounding errors on their quarterly reports. The flames did not punish at random. They were specific. They were exact. They were, in the truest and most terrible sense, fair, and the city rang like a struck bell with the sound of millions of people confronting, for the first time, the actual weight of themselves. And at the center of the ring, in the burning ruin of the tower, the amplification did to Homelander what the entity alone had failed to do. It showed him himself. Not the icon on the billboards. Not the god descending through clouds. Not the product, the brand, the ratings, the anthem. Just the truth, arranged in a line that stretched from a laboratory crib to this burning rooftop. He saw the boy who had reached for a doctor's hand and been met with instruments. He saw the exact moment the boy had stopped reaching. He saw every person he had killed, and the vision did not let him watch from outside his own eyes. He felt the laser leave his face from the inside of their terror. He felt the water close over the plane full of people he had abandoned. Felt how long they had screamed. Felt the precise instant each of them had understood that the hero was not coming back. He had always told himself they were beneath him, that their fear was worship, that their deaths were weather. The fire took all of that away and left nothing between Homelander and Homelander. Just a frightened child who had become a monster because no one, not once in 40 years, had ever stopped him. He fell to his knees in the ash of his own temple, and the most powerful being on the planet made a sound no camera had ever recorded, and no publicist could ever have survived. Ghost Rider found him there. The spirit of vengeance walked through the flames that were rewriting the moral history of an entire city and stood over the kneeling god. And there was no triumph in the burning skull, no savor. This was the oldest part of the Rider's work, and it never became pleasant. Judgment, he said, and his voice rolled across the rooftop like the sea, cannot be escaped by strength. Homelander's answer was to attack. Of course it was. It was the only language he had ever been taught, the one the laboratory had beaten into him before he could speak. He came up off his knees with heat vision blazing and 40 years of agony converted, in an instant, into the only thing he knew how to make of it, violence. Their final confrontation tore across the collapsing tower like the end of the world, and this time there was no crowd, no cameras, no narrative, nothing but the two of them and the truth. Homelander was stronger. It did not matter. Ghost Rider caught him by the face with a burning hand, and for the first time the full and unmerciful measure of the Rider's power was unleashed. The penance stare. Look into my eyes. Everything Homelander had ever inflicted came home, not as memory, as experience. Every blow he had ever landed, he now received. Every life he had ever ended, he now lost. The pain of thousands rolled through his soul in a single endless moment. The whole unpayable debt presented for collection, and his scream joined the sound the city was already making, one more note in the vast chord of consequence. And then the impossible thing happened. He survived it, not because he was strong enough. Nothing mortal or manufactured was strong enough, and Ghost Rider knew it in the instant the stare broke. The judgment had not failed. It had been interrupted. Deep in the structure of the storm, the false spirit, the thing Vought had grown in its vault, had reached up and seized the torrent of penance pouring through Homelander and drunk it. It had been born to mimic judgment, to wear it, to own it. And here was the real thing, flowing like a river, and it could not resist. It swallowed the punishment meant for the man and made it part of itself. It was the last thing it should ever have done, because true judgment is not energy. It cannot be harvested, stored, or wielded, and a hollow imitation that swallows the real thing is a lie trying to contain the truth. The false spirit convulsed across the burning sky. The stolen suffering that made up its body began to tear against the genuine penance now burning inside it. Ghost Rider felt it happen, felt the whole towering storm stutter like an engine thrown into the wrong gear, and he understood in a flash of cold fire what the end of this story had to be. The battle was no longer about Homelander. It had never really been about Homelander. It was about the thing Vought had made, the hunger wearing judgment's face. And that thing, fat with stolen fire and rupturing from within, was now tearing at the sky itself, clawing open the same kind of wound between worlds that had brought the Rider here. If the rift opened, the corruption would not stop at this universe. Ghost Rider looked at the forming portal, and at the broken man kneeling in the ash, and at the storm that was beginning to eat the world. He had one road left, and he could see exactly where it ended. The choice, if it can be called a choice, took Ghost Rider less than a heartbeat. The rift opening above the tower was a door home. The spirit of vengeance had no attachment to this poisoned world, no duty written into its ancient law that bound it here. It had answered a call, and the call had been answered. It could ride through that burning wound in the sky, back to its own roads and its own hunt, and leave this universe to the consequences of its own corruption. Many would have called that justice. Vought had made this thing. Let Vaught's world be consumed by it. But the spirit of vengeance had never once, across all its existence, walked away from the innocent. And below this dying tower were 8 million of them, and beyond this world were countless others the spreading corruption would reach, and the law that burned at the core of the rider's being did not weigh worlds on scales. Wrong was wrong. The hunt was the hunt. The fire stayed. Ghost Rider turned his motorcycle away from the door home and aimed it at the heart of the storm. What happened above the city in the next minutes, the few surviving witnesses would spend the rest of their lives failing to describe. The false spirit had become something beyond scale, a hurricane of black fire and stolen voices wrapped around a wound in reality. And the rider went into it the way a bullet goes into a wall, straight up the collapsing face of Vought Tower and off its broken crown and into the churning dark. He did not fight the storm from outside, because outside did not matter anymore. He rode into its center, into the hollow where a soul should have been, and there, in the middle of everything Vought had ever done, he opened his own fire without limit. Hellfire is not heat, it is truth, burning. And from inside the false spirit, the spirit of vengeance began to burn every lie the thing was made of. Every stolen voice it had swallowed, he severed gently and set free, and they rose out of the storm over the city like sparks, like a migration of souls, and the people on the streets below looked up and wept without knowing why. The genuine penance the creature had drunk turned in its depths like a blade. The entity thrashed across the sky, tearing at the rift, at the tower, at the world. But it was coming apart from the inside now, and it knew it, and its scream was every scream Vought had ever caused, given back at last. The tower, meanwhile, was dying. The amplifiers in its foundation had burned out. The upper structure had been a battlefield for two gods in a storm. And now the great cathedral of the superhero age began its final collapse with thousands still flooding out of its base. Starlight was in the street below, spent to her last spark, screaming at the fleeing crowds to run faster, watching the building lean and knowing it was not enough. The fall zone would swallow the avenue. The avenue was still full of people, and on the rooftop, alone in the ash, Homelander raised his head. He could have left. No force on earth could have stopped him from leaving. He was still the fastest thing in the sky, still strong beyond reason, and every instinct the laboratory had installed in him. Every lesson of 40 years said survive, fly, rebuild, find another crowd to worship you. For a long moment, he simply floated there above the burning edge of the roof. And everyone who later told this story believed, with complete confidence, that they knew which way he would go. Then Homelander looked down at the avenue full of small, fragile, meaningless people, the kind he had spent his life regarding as scenery, and something that was not the laboratory and was not Vought, and was not the brand moved inside the hollow of him. Very slightly, for the first time, he went down, not away, down. He put himself beneath the failing spine of the tower, beneath steel and concrete massing more than anything he had ever attempted, and he lifted. The most powerful man in the world held up a dying skyscraper with his bare hands, while his muscles tore and his bones creaked and his blood ran, and he held it. He held it while the last stragglers stumbled out of the plaza. He held it while Starlight stared up at him with her mouth open, unable to fit what she was seeing into anything she knew about him. He held it 1 second longer than anyone believed possible, and then, with a sound like the world clearing its throat, he hurled himself clear as Vought Tower came down forever. It was not redemption. The writer would have said so, and so would Maeve, and so would every name in every blackmail archive. One lifted building does not balance one abandoned airplane. It was not forgiveness, and it earned him none, but it was the first genuinely selfless act of his entire existence, the first thing he had ever done that cost him something and bought him nothing, and the fact of it would follow him to the end of his life. At the same instant, at the heart of the storm, Ghost Rider finished his work. The false spirit gave one final convulsion, and the hellfire reached its hollow center, and the thing that Vought had built to own judgment died as it had lived, a lie collapsing under the weight of the truth. The black fire turned gold. The storm broke apart across the sky like a wave giving up on the shore. The rift, untethered from the thing that had torn it open, folded slowly inward. The flames ringing the city guttered and went out, street by street, and the visions released their grip on 8 million souls at once. The tower's fall ended in a rolling ocean of dust that swallowed the plaza and stilled. Silence came to the city for the first time in hours, and it sounded like the aftermath of a war, because that is what it was. Ghost Rider stood alone in the ruins. His fire burned low. Around him lay the broken throne of the empire that had tried to buy damnation, and above him the last seam of the rift waited, patient, final, a door standing open that would not stand open long. Homelander was nowhere to be seen. The rider searched the smoke with senses older than this universe, and he found no body, and that absence told him more than any corpse could have. But the hunt, for once, did not call him to follow. Tonight the fire was spent, and judgment had been rendered, and the final accounting of that one damaged soul belonged to a future that had not yet arrived. Ghost Rider looked once more at the ruins of Vought Tower, and then he looked toward the door between worlds. He had one judgment left to deliver, and it was not for a person, it was for the world. The morning after, the world woke up expecting the familiar machinery. It had been trained to expect it. Somewhere, the survivors assumed, Vought's crisis teams were already drafting the statement, selecting the scapegoat, cutting the tribute video with the swelling music. That was how every catastrophe in living memory had ended, with the company wrapping the truth in an American flag and selling it back to the public at a markup. But this time, the machinery did not answer. There was no machinery. The tower was a crater, the executive floor was a casualty list, and the company's surviving mid-level employees, the analysts and assistants and junior lawyers who had spent careers shredding documents on command, looked at the burning ring of fire that had shown the whole city its own sins, looked at the empty chairs of their masters, and made a decision no executive would ever have predicted. They opened the archives. Everything came out. It came out in a flood that no injunction could slow, because the people who would have filed the injunctions were gone, and the people holding the files no longer believed the lie. Project Vengeance became public knowledge within days. The vault, the artifacts, the experiments, the deliberate attempt to manufacture and own supernatural judgment. The Compound V trials poured out behind it, decades of them, the numbered infants, the facilities that did not exist. The euphemisms finally translated into what they had always meant. The world learned that its heroes had been made, not born, and that the making had been paid for in children's lives. And the learning changed something fundamental that could never be changed back. The seven, what remained of them, shattered along lines that surprised no one who had been paying attention. The Deep gave a rambling, weeping interview that was somehow both self-serving and the most honest thing he had ever done. A train disappeared from public view entirely, and those who knew him said he had simply stopped running, as if he had finally found the one thing he could not outrun and had decided to sit down beside it. Black Noir was never accounted for, and Starlight became something she had spent years trying and failing to be inside the machine, the conscience of an entire shattered industry. She stood before congressional hearings and news cameras and angry crowds, and she did not defend the indefensible, and she did not perform remorse for effect. She simply told the truth over and over in rooms that did not want to hear it until the rooms began to change. It was Starlight who said the sentence that ended up carved into the debate that consumed the country for years. Power had been allowed to answer to no one. Never again. Governments moved, cautiously at first and then with gathering force. The era of the superhuman as private property, as walking weapons system with a publicist, began to close. New laws were drafted with names like accountability and oversight that would have been laughed out of every boardroom a year earlier. No one believed the laws would be enough. Everyone understood they were the beginning of something rather than the end, and that beginnings, in the long history of consequence, matter. But beneath all the hearings and headlines, one mystery outweighed every other, and the whole world argued about it in bars and broadcasts and late-night silence. Where was Homelander? No body was ever recovered from the crater of Vought Tower. 1,000 theories filled the void. He had died holding the building, said the ones who had seen the plaza, and they told the story of those impossible seconds like scripture, and nobody could ever quite disprove them. He had fled, said others, gone to ground somewhere beyond extradition and satellites, waiting the way monsters wait. Vought's remaining loyalists insisted he would return to restore the natural order. The crowds who had watched him kneel in the ash on every screen in the world were no longer sure there was a natural order, and said so. Ghost Rider knew. That is all that can be said with certainty. On his last night in that world, standing at the edge of the ruined city with the rift waiting behind him like a held breath, the spirit of vengeance reached out across the distances with senses that no wall or border could turn aside. And he found the man, far away, alone, not dead, not redeemed, not anything that had a name yet, stripped of the tower, the brand, the cameras, the worship, the entire architecture that had propped him up for 40 years, and for the first time since the laboratory crib, answerable to no one but the silence and the memory of a burning gaze that had shown him the full weight of what he was. The rider tasted that soul on the wind, and what he found there was not peace and was not penance. It was a man standing at the bottom of himself, in the dark, with a long climb above him and no guarantee he would ever begin it. It was not the rider's work to finish. The fire knew the difference between judgment delivered and judgment merely owed. Homelander's debt remained on the ledger. It would wait. The ledger, as the spirit of vengeance had learned across more lifetimes than any world had stars, was patient. Before he rode for the rift, Ghost Rider stood a final moment looking back at the broken skyline, at the crater where the Cathedral of Lies had stood, and the whole meaning of his time in this world settled into a single clear shape, the way embers settle before dawn. Vought had made many mistakes, a whole architecture of them, but only one had been fatal. They had believed that evil could be owned, that it could be measured in a laboratory, dosed into vials, wrapped in a flag, priced, marketed, scheduled, controlled. They had looked at the oldest force in creation, the consequence that follows every cruel choice like a shadow follows a body, and they had seen only an unexploited asset. They had tried to put judgment itself in a cage and charge admission, but vengeance was never theirs. It does not belong to corporations, or governments, or gods who were manufactured in boardrooms. It belongs to the choices themselves. It is the echo, and no one owns the echo. You can bury the files, buy the courts, burn the witnesses, and still the echo comes, because it was never traveling toward you from somewhere outside. It was always already inside the walls, in the marrow of the thing you built, waiting. Power does not make anyone a god. Fear does not make anyone invincible. A cape is only cloth, a brand is only ink, and a tower is only steel arranged against the sky for a little while. No matter how high a person rises above consequence, no matter how completely they seem to escape it, there is a ledger, and there is a moment, always, when the account comes due. Every single soul in that burning city had learned it in one night. The company that ruled the world had learned it last of all. The engine rose to a low growl. The rift opened before him like a road remembering itself. Ghost Rider released the brake, and the flames trailed behind him one last time across that world's dark asphalt, and the wound in the sky closed over the rider and the fire and the sound, until there was nothing left but a scorched line on an empty highway and a cooling wind. And in the city behind him, on a distant rooftop at the edge of the river, something watched him go. A figure stood in the dark where no camera reached, wrapped in a coat stolen from a shelter, bare-headed, human-looking, small. The face that had once smiled from every billboard in America was thinner now, and older, and stripped of the serene confidence that had been its most famous feature. The eyes that watched the last ember of hellfire vanish between the worlds were red, but only from weeping and from memory. Homelander had survived, and somewhere inside the hollow of him, etched deeper than the laboratory had ever reached, the penance stare remained. He felt it when he closed his eyes. He felt the plane, the water, the screaming, all of it, every night, a debt with no number and no terms, held by a creditor who had ridden out of the world but not, he suspected, out of his future. He stood on that rooftop until the sun came up over a city that no longer worshipped him. And for the first time in his life, Homelander was not thinking about what he was owed. He was thinking about what he owed. And far beyond the walls of the world, on roads that run between the stars, the spirit of vengeance rode on, patient as fire, leaving behind one final question hanging in the cooling air of a changed earth, a question with no answer yet, a question for the future to fear. If the rider ever returned, would Homelander finally be ready for judgment?